Hello, everyone, and particularly hello to Matt, who is our guest for this evening. Um,
Greetings.
yeah. So Matt is an instructor of Japanese swordsmanship, particularly or specifically Nakamura Ryu Battodo at Kuroyama Dojo in Sydney. Um, and so yeah, so I think to start off with, can you tell us a little bit about Nakamura Ryu Battodo, like how does that fit in sort of the general spectrum of Japanese sword arts? Like, is it more like Kendo? Is it more like Kinjitsu, Iaido? Like,
It's an interesting one. For those that don't know, most Japanese arts originally it was a pyramid, so you'd have your sparring, your kata, and other, whether it's cutting or other type of
mm,
impact. But the most schools nowadays only do two of the three.
mm,
So Nakamura focuses more on the kata and the cutting side of things. We do paired kata, which comes very close to impact, but we pull our cuts.
mm,
Some of the seniors, you'll see them do a demo where they actually have live bamboo and they'll cut the bamboo before they do the demo with live
mm.
blades,
Oh,
which is very impressive. Like I've done it once, which is enough for me, with a shinken stopping here, like a centimeter from your neck.
mm,
It's quite full on. Traditionally, it's actually an evolved system, so it's called a Gendai system. So it's not Koryu, which is what a lot of the traditional
mm.
Japanese sword systems that people would see on YouTube movies. Um,
So
but it's
Koryu is, so is that Koryu, that's traditional, like sort of hundreds of
pre-Meiji.
years old,
Yeah.
pre-Meiji. Okay,
Mm.
pre-Meiji, yep. Yeah, so I find with all of these, there's always a bunch of people in the audience who don't know what a lot of terms are. So just quickly, major restoration was Japan opening up from its being isolated for hundreds of years and modernizing in the 1870s. So Koryu was everything sort of pre 1870s, and then Gendai is everything post, or
Yeah,
is that just yeah? Okay,
pretty
cool.
much. And also they had there's a list of the all of the extant Koryu systems that are still around. There's a I can't remember the proper name, but there's a body in Japan that maintains like a
Mm.
historical list of all the lineages.
Oh,
Nakamura is a bit interesting because it's based on Toyama Ryu. There's
mm,
in Japanese systems you usually have what's called a ha, which is a split lineage. So you might have one system which then splits into various subsystems.
mm,
Can be politics, can be family splitting up, people moving.
mm,
So Toyama is there's three ha. Two of them are definitely extant. One of them was supposedly died out in the 70s, but I believe there is a Koryu Jiu-Jitsu system that
mm,
teaches that ha, so which is good to hear.
mm.
My system, Nakamura Ha, is basically Nakamura Sensei learned Toyama Ryu and then added his own kata and knowledge into that.
Okay, so yeah, so it's kind of like a variant of Toyama Ryu. Um, what's Toyama Ryu like? Um, so is that because is that a Koryu? Or is that like a more modern system?
No, it's a gun test system. So what they prior to the Second World War in the 1920s, I believe,
Hmm.
the military academy, which is the Toyama military academy, they wanted to change back to using Japanese style swords because
Hmm.
after the Meiji Restoration, there was a move towards Western style sabers, like French sabers specifically.
Hmm.
So they wanted to move back to the original weapons that they would have used pre Meiji,
Hmm.
and they brought in a gentleman called Nakayuma Hakado, who was a headmaster of a system called Musa Shindenryu.
Hmm.
And he codified a lot of the systems. You can, Toyama is sometimes called like meat and potatoes, which is not
Hmm.
to deride it at all. It's a very simple system that originally was seven kata, dealing
Hmm.
with attacks from either side, from behind. And it was the basics. If you went to military academy now, you'd learn how to do, rifle drill or anything like
Hmm.
that. This was the system that was developed to codify sword.
Okay, yeah, so sort of similar to like in European fencing, you know, your military manuals are very, very simple, like, seven
Yeah.
cuts, 7 parries, maybe 1 or 2 other drills to maybe not. Whereas, yeah, like if you compare that to a civilian fencing manual, there's, numerous lessons, and they go into like a lot more detail. So Toyama is kind of a similar thing where it's just really, really stripped down, sort of back to basics.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
The emphasis, of course, though, is on speed. So when you talk about Yajitsu, which if people are not aware of, Yajitsu is probably the sword equivalent of quick draw pistol shooting. So the cut is the first cut is designed to be done much faster than your opponent. But the background, the Katsujinkan theory behind it is you never draw first. So the skill level is to let your opponent begin to draw. But you're skilled enough to defeat them, but you always give them a chance. So all of our kata are designed with a slight pause so that if they change their mind, it doesn't end in bloodshed.
Okay, so kind of almost kind of like the Kurosawa films when you guys are sort of standing off and.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah. Okay, so you do a much more stripped down sort of system. Have you had much exposure to Koryu and classical systems?
So interesting, yeah. So the first set of kata, we have 3 sets of 8 kata. So originally Toyama is 7. Nakamura Sensei added an 8th kata to the first set to make it 8. Good number in Japanese culture. And then the difference in the ha's is that the next set of katas are individual to the instructors. So those 2 instructors that I know about, they moved off and created their own system, and they've added stuff. So Nakamura Sensei, he had studied Kendo and also Hombu Ryu, which is a very old system, which is now part of another old Koryu system called Musajikiden Eishinryu, which is quite famous. So some of our paired kata and the second set of kata come from this. And then the third set is about very advanced cutting and more, it's not freestyle, but it's more what a real situation. So first set of kata is the basics, learning how to handle the sword, how to move with the sword. The second set is learning how to cut properly without injuring yourself, which is the way that the cuts are done. They're quite full powered. So it's kind of a safety set of kata, but it has lots of interesting kamae, which is what the postures, so you've got, the differences from where you would hold the sword and how you'd initiate an attack. And so the third set brings all that together, and the intent is much higher as well. So when you perform the third set of Nakamura kata, it's not like you're on the battlefield, but the thinking is that you would only perform those kata in the way that you would on the battlefield.
Oh, so like sort of full strength, full power.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, as opposed to just with someone yelling at you to take a bridge or whatever. you don't have anyone giving you orders in the background. What's he doing?
That's it.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess things the kata and the Japanese is it seems very specific. Like you're not just doing a specific curriculum of movements per se, but like even the way those movements are combined follows a very, very specific kind of like specific curriculum, specific order. Like is there any point where you do like sort of like freestyle kata or sparring or anything where you're making decisions about the movements you're using, or is it all very much, scripted kata and then
officially no, but when you first start, it takes a long time to bed down the movements. One thing I've noticed with teaching is there's very few natural swords people, and we're renowned for using long swords and heavy swords. So at the end of the scale, for someone who does European style sword, it's like the difference between a short, side sword up to a very large 2-handed arming sword. That's the variance between the Japanese styles and the length of the swords that they use. So we don't wear daisho, so we don't wear a second short sword because it's developed from a military system. It's just one long sword.
Yeah.
And then once you've got sort of, probably anyone who's ever seen Japanese style sheathing of the sword, the noto. It's very quick. It's very dangerous if you do it with the sharp sword. So you start off with wooden swords just to get your mind around moving the system. Usually, general practice is with what they call a yaito, which is if you looked at it, you wouldn't know that it wasn't a sharp sword. It's usually an aluminium alloy blade that's been chrome plated, so it looks like steel. And the handle and the scabbard and everything else is identical to that which we would have on a sharp sword. Generally, it's for economy because obviously a top-line Japanese sword is very expensive. And we tend to not use cheaper versions because the weight is not as well balanced as with a proper Japanese system. So majority of people would use those.
Okay, so and so using something with like a lighter blade to sort of mimic.
It's usually not too much difference in weight. My yaito is about 1150 grams, and my shinken's about 1.3, so 1300 grams. Okay. So it's more also for repetitive strength because we do, we don't have a lot of divergence in what we do. So the end of all of our kata is pretty much the same. So when we go into the resheathing, so it doesn't matter if you're doing freestyle or set kata, the repetition is quite hard on your limbs. So having that constant sort of weight, slightly less than what you would use before, is beneficial.
Okay, yeah. So you want something a bit lighter, just so you can train for longer.
Yeah.
So there's in the sense there's a lot of repetition. Particularly compared to European sword systems, which are very very focused on getting people up and competitive. Less so, certainly with modern post-Enlightenment, you get to the Enlightenment, and particularly into the 19th century, where sword fighting becomes about leisure. It's very, European sword fighting becomes very much about, something you can do with your friends in the drawing room, or something you can do, as like a parlor game and stuff.
Yeah.
Earlier Middle Ages, not quite as much, although there's still a big emphasis on kind of, I guess, sort of free play and sparring, and whereas I get the sense for me with Japanese swordsmanship, it's much more about doing a sequence of movements or seeking kind of perfection movement. Would that be accurate?
It's the repetition. It's very there is a bit of a cliche about it, but it's very much the Zen style of polish. So you're never perfect. You're constantly seeking that perfection. And like myself, if I train on my own, I'll push myself harder than if I'm training or teaching others, because you just get into the groove and you're just trying to reach that point. So of course you do get better each time you practice, and the kind of practice you do. It's about, it's an anachronistic art, so we know that we're never going to be fighting anyone with a sword. Some of the challenges we have in Australia, like I said, we use cutting is very much, Nakamura is renowned for cutting targets. For those who aren't aware, the targets we use are rolled up tatami mats, the floor coverings from Japanese homes and restaurants. They recycle them. So every spring they rip up the mats and put them out on the curb, and all the sword schools pick them up and beat them to get all the dirt out, and then you soak them in water, roll them up, and then you cut them. So they're quite good. The problem with Australia is you can't get them in the country anymore. So I managed to...
just as a COVID problem, or import?
No, there's two issues. I finally tracked down the owner of Mugendachi, who's the biggest outside of Japan reseller of tatami. So in Japan they use used, which you can't get into Australia because of biosecurity. And so Mugendachi sourced theirs from the actual manufacturer in China. So most of the mats aren't made in Japan anymore. They're made in China. But unfortunately, just as I got the contract to be the reseller, the factory closed. So we're trying, and in the old days we had beach mats and things like that, but everything's disappeared. You don't see them anymore. So nowadays when I cut green bamboo. That's my target.
Okay, yeah, and it's probably good, good if anyone's got a bamboo infestation.
Yes.
Japanese sword school into just
And people find it weird when we cut. There's a lot of criticism. It's I understand it when you look at what I do and how we cut. We don't cut at full speed, so you might see, your classic backyard ninjas and cutters that cut on YouTube, and that's fine. That they're doing what they do. but we don't go full force really fast. All of our cuts are measured. The methodology and the thinking behind it is that you should be calm when you cut, and the application transfers into the blade through the target. So you don't need to, one of the terms is one cut, one kill. So you might see us cut the target several times, but each of those cuts is a cut. That's an opponent.
Yes, but trying to stay relaxed.
Yes, and speed as well. So you slow down. So during judging and competition, you get penalised for going too fast. So and they put little hiccups in, so you have to change direction, but without the momentum from your previous cut. That's what makes it difficult.
Okay, so it's because I was wondering how you would score a cutting competition. Because I'm like, there's got to come a point where you're just good at cutting, and so how, like, I don't know. I was always very, very curious about like how you'd make a competition out of cutting, as opposed to, there's a point where the average person can cut.
Yeah.
So how are the competitions scored?
So there's several things at play. I've lost out on medals. I go to Japan, well, up until relatively recently, go to Japan every year. I've come first in international competition, which is a great honour. But I've lost out in winning medals by footwork. There's one particular judge, when you get quite high, he doesn't look at you cut at all. All he does is look at your feet from the beginning to the end. And I didn't know this until someone explained it. And of course, the whole time I'm trying to cut, I'm thinking feet. And, it just gets you. There's that mental block. One of the other things, you've got your set angles. You're allowed within a certain range of that angle. The medium itself, because it's made up, the roll is probably about 5 inches across. It's probably made up of several thousand individual reeds, the bundle. So if you hit it wrong, you get your blade stuck. People bend their blades. Pieces go flying. So if you hit a diagonal cut across the target, the remnant of mat should only land about 1.5 feet away from the target. It shows you that the angle is cutting. If the piece of mat goes flying, you've either scooped it and caught it with the side of the blade, or
Yeah. Also, I guess that would make cutting very, very calmly, like cutting without a lot of force, very helpful, because your piece is not going to fall near as far if you're not hitting.
That's right.
Yeah.
And also, there's other things, like if you hit the target wrong, the sound. So you get a beautiful sound, a soaked mat, because of those pieces of reed. If you hit it just right, you get a lovely zipping sound as your sword goes through it. The Japanese swords are ground to like a appleseed shape. They're not flat, and they're not lenticular like a lot of blades. They've actually got this weird sort of shape to them. So if you're they cut perfectly, but if you're ever so slightly off, the power gets transferred down into the target or up. And especially if you're going down, because we usually cut in a gymnasium on like a sprung floor, you get this horrible thunk sound as you hit the target, like an axe hitting a piece of wood. So that's one of the audio cues.
Okay, so the judges have all these little sort of these things that they look for. How important is the competition to your practice? Like, with the average, let's say the average person who is not invested enough, like is not necessarily invested enough to go to Japan every year, just kind of wants to, swing some swords once or twice a week. How much competition would they be involved in, or like, how much of a sense of competition would they have? Like, with HEMA, like I've been in like one tournament years ago, but
it's as much as you want. That's so, because it's a personal journey. So, for example, I've got several students now who've been training me for a long time. They're all around the same rank, and I actually can't teach them anything now. Or they know how to do everything as it's supposed to be done. Their problem now is they have to move themselves into a different headspace to become what they want to become. So I can help and I can point them when I see errors, but at the end of the day, it's what they want to do. And it comes back to the cutting and the competition aspect. When you get there, especially when you get to a higher level, I don't know if you're familiar in golf, there's a term called the yips, where brilliant golfers suddenly lose their form, and they can't do it. So my best cut is a from the left to right diagonal cut. a couple of years ago, I got the yips and I could not cut on that side. It's purely psychological. It's not a mechanical issue. It's something that happens to you. So when you're there in Japan, for me, that competition is I'm representing Australia, but also I'm competing against America, England, other Japanese people. So if you're into that, it's a very cool headspace to get into. But also, I'm representing my dojo, my instructor, and the art at the same time. So you've got this kind of split view.
Like
yeah,
it's kind of like like the sort of this competition stress sort of thing.
that's right.
Yeah, which and that is something that a lot of a lot of martial arts practitioners, or particularly talk about, and even like actually in European swordsmanship or like in fencing, the original impetus behind fencing competitions, like formal competitions, and like 19th century was looking for ways to stress their students out to induce kind of
That's exactly what it is. Exactly what it
yeah.
is. Yeah, it's a stress test. So when we do Tameshigiri, which is the cutting, it's a test cut. So you're not actually testing the blade, you're not testing the target, you're testing yourself, and that's what happens. It becomes a mental test rather than a physical test. Because it's easy. I've taught cutting seminars where I've had multiple year, decades experienced swords people in other styles, other Japanese styles, and a kid off the street. And the kid off the street, I gave him a sword, he could cut perfectly. But the people from other sword styles didn't have difficulty because they couldn't cut, but because their system was different, there was more of a mental aspect of them trying to adjust to cutting. So it definitely is what your experience is always individual.
Okay. Yeah, and do you think that sort of that tradition or that like that kind of psychological aspect is part of is that a big part of sort of the Japanese martial tradition?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, like they're sort of preparing. Because I mean, you do hear about that in a lot of different fighting traditions. Is when you're getting people ready for war, you don't just like it's not just about learning the technique. It's actually about being psychologically ready.
It's interesting what happens as well. Like as I was saying before, those that can't get to Japan, we're very lucky in Australia. Outside of COVID, my instructor travels from Nagoya to Townsville every year, so we get access to top level. He's a 8th Dan, which is second highest you can get in our system. So and that's where everyone gets graded as well. So whilst I'm on the grading panel, it's not up to me. It's up to the instructors from Japan. So that's another type of mental pressure that you can put on yourself. You don't have to grade, it's strictly personal, but it puts you in that high stress situation. Quite often I've been surprised where he's tapped me on the shoulder the night before the grading and said that I'm grading, which is always fun to do. You no practice, no preparedness. But one of the things is we're talking about the mental aspect where we do our paired kata. If I do it with one of my students, it's stressful and it's always dangerous. Even the blunt blades that we use have a very sharp point. And one of the target areas is this nice little piece here. And if you stuff up and get the footwork wrong, it will go right through that. There's no muscle there to stop the impact. Whereas I've done demos with my instructor from Japan, and it's like, I don't know, it's probably like if you were asked to go up on stage and sing at a rock concert with one of your, idols, you're completely transported. You have no, it doesn't feel like you're on the same planet. Once you get sucked in and you do that, say 3 or 4 set of kata together, it's only when you finish, and it's the most bizarre feeling because the sum total of your skills gets lifted up to exponentially to a different level.
Yeah, so in sort of like a flow state kind of thing as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. And so this is what you've talked about. So this is a very, very kata orientated sword system. Is that representative of like all Japanese swordsmiths?
No, not at all.
Systems? So you were talking about like the pyramid before.
Yeah.
So you have some that you said you had some. There are some that are sparring based.
Yeah. For example, we have a sword versus spear kata and sword versus sword, where there's no impact. You can do it with like buffers or something like that. I've got some sparring buffers that I use for beginners, because it's one of the hardest things. If you do a lot of kata-based systems, when you move to, as you probably experienced in Western arts, when you actually move to not quite impact but close range, it's a whole new ball game. Some people freak out, some people get too into it, and they really want to, hit you hard. One of the problems we have is because our target areas and the way that we learn to cut, it's very dangerous to spar for us. It's hard for us to pull our cuts into that, safe space. Whereas a lot of systems, like Kendo, they've got their specific armor set. Kendo is really a sport now rather than a martial art. They've removed a lot of the targets. I can't remember the name of the system, but it's something. If I had a lot of money, I would buy the kit. They have the huge leather forearms on their gloves. So the gloves are almost, the width of your head. And their system, they do a lot of wrist to elbow cutting. So when they practice, they don't do so much kata. They actually do, hitting with that. So yeah, it's something that I'd like to do, but it's hard to do safely in my system. So
yeah, is that just is that just like because you don't want to wear protective gear, or you don't want to use simulators, or it's like I don't know, I find it really, really interesting that or actually I don't know for a fact, was there a point where Japanese swordsmanship was very, very bouting orientated in the training?
yes,
And then it slowly moved towards being more kata orientated, or has that always been the case?
So I can't really speak for a lot of kata, but I do know that that's where Kendo developed from. It was sparring originally with wooden bokken, and that's how the shinai, the split bamboo sort of impact weapon came from, to make it safer. I mean, original Kendo, there were throws. To win, you generally throw your opponent and pull their helmet off, which is quite uncomfortable. And like with all things, it evolved into something else. One of my systems that I'd love to learn is a Japanese spear system that actually has like padded spear tips, and they absolutely hit each other with the spear tips. So that's, again, there's another system which does naginata, but they have a lot of sword versus naginata, sword versus tanto, and they're much more impact and contact orientated because of the way that they train.
Okay, yeah, and it's sort of. So do you know why why there was a split? Like why is it that there are now, you can be part of entire sort of culture and do entire activity that is just kata and test cutting, or in the case of Kendo, just sparring. Although
I really don't know. I think it's habit, or maybe human nature. There's some. I can't speak for Kendo, but I do know that they used to have kata, and some systems, some federations still do the kata of Kendo, and some don't do it at all. Originally, Sete Yai was developed by the Kendo Federation to get people back into using a sword. So that's where they took the Kendo Federation had a lot of very senior Iaido practitioners from Koryu systems, and they each took one kata or several and forged it into one. Seite means basics, basically. So a basic set of kata that everyone could learn who wanted to learn how to use the sword better. But again, it's changed from what I have read. You used to do the Seite kata and then choose the Koryu from the kata that you liked the best, and then you would go on to do that form. But they've added more kata to Seite, so it's become its own thing. So it's almost like how rugby league split from rugby union. There's people who like to do certain things, so they keep down that path, or they leave and do something else.
Yeah, so sort of people are specializing their activities based on.
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess a lot of it comes down to health and safety at the end of the day as well. Like, looking at HEMA and looking at all the people, the way that they've developed the armor over even the last 5 to 10 years, nothing like that has actually happened yet with Japanese systems. So it would be good to have that ability. But then again, you run into the issue of, would it be frowned upon or would it be acceptable? It's very much a cultural aspect as well.
Yeah, well, I guess that's kind of a big thing about Japanese swordsmanship, is it's not necessarily about like general skill in the sense of trying to do a thing. It's about maintaining a tradition. Like it's about going right. Like we are going to perfect these specific movements. Whereas like one thing you see with Western fencing is it's it'll go through periods of incredible change incredibly quickly. I mean, I look at I look at sort of like the 20th century. Saber in the 20th century, saber fencing, the saber fencing I do from the 1880s, 1890s is different even to the saber fencing of like the 1930s and 40s. Most of that is actually the result of a change in equipment, like when you get them on sort of really kind of thin, light, saber, the way Olympic saber, the way of using that, the optimal way of using that is so different to the optimal way of using, a 700-gram saber that it changes really, really rapidly. So I find that a very, very interesting aspect about Japanese swordsmanship is there seems to be a very, very explicit goal of maintaining a tradition, or teaching a very, very specific art to maintain it.
I think it comes from its history where it's a lot of it was clan based. So a lot of the systems that are extant now came from they were a specific area's style. So if you lived in, say, Albury or Wodonga, you would learn one system. If you lived in Sydney, you'd learn another. And like again with Toyama Ryu, one the other major ha, they do what's called hibiki, which is, I don't know if you've seen it. It's with the blunted steel swords, and they wear, looks like kendo armor but with chainmail and lots of extra padding. So that does exist, and like I said, in a lot of the some of the older arts, they've got more very traditional but more protective outfits. So it might not be free sparring or competition like you would see in HEMA, but there's definitely contact there. I was very disappointed a few years back. I'm not sure if you saw, there was a company in New Zealand that was making, they were trying to bring all of the arts together with a combat fighting system where they had special padded armor. It looked quite good. I contacted the guy, but one of the disappointments was they were using a Bokken type simulator made out of like high impact plastic or rubber. And when I asked them how they scored, I asked them how they scored, and they said, "Oh, it doesn't matter." I said, "Well, it does, because my system, you have to hit with the edge. You can't hit, if you hit with the side, it's damage, but it's not a hit." And they shut me down and said, "Oh, no, you don't know what you're talking about." So I was like, "Okay, there you go."
That's a bit rude, because in HEMA competitions, that's a big thing. Is if you don't hit with the edge, then it's not a valid hit. And actually, even in the 19th century, that's a thing that they talk about. Like there's a lot of criticism of, or discussion about steel sword, using a blunt steel sword as opposed to a single stick with a leather handguard. And a lot of the complaint about single stick is, well, it's a stick fighting system, not a sword system, because you don't have to worry about edge alignment.
Yes.
And I think I think it would be interesting. I think we are moving towards it. Like I know there's a lot of Japanese swordsmanship practitioners are starting to look more at sort of bouting and like sparring, and also like cross bouting. And it wouldn't surprise me if in a couple of years we actually start to see, like long sword tournaments where you've also got, people, coming in with katanas and possibly even like African and Indian swords, depending on, where those traditions are at.
What I find interesting is I've done a few sparring matches very badly. It's not something I really do, but one thing I think is common across all, and it comes back to what we were talking about with, learning the kata and the way you do it. It all comes back to breathing at the end of the day. If you can't, it took me probably 6 or 7 years to realize that when I was competing in Japan that I wasn't breathing properly, and it still took me probably another year and a half to actually figure out how to breathe properly. And I remember the first time I put on, I think we were only sparring with Shinai and a gambazon and a fencing mask. But as soon as I put that on, the added heat load and my ability to breathe was immediately obvious. So I was like, okay, this is gonna end badly for the first time I try this.
Yeah, well, that's like that's the kind of thing about sparring. is there's all those little there's all those little things. Like I actually had a similar experience when I started doing boxing. So I'd been doing HEMA for a few years, and I'm like, I want to do something unarmed. So I started doing boxing and wrestling, and yeah, it was like the first few lessons, I learned a lot about like mechanics and breathing particularly, and just how to not exhaust yourself over a long, or very very quickly. Because yeah, it was, and it is a really really big thing. I think there's a lot of there's a lot more to any martial art than just doing the movements. There's all those sort of like there's little things, knowing how to breathe, knowing how to judge distance, even knowing how to relax. Like actually, another kind of interesting parallel with what you're talking about before, to my experience with boxing. In boxing, they really emphasize. They say don't try and hit the pads of your bag as hard as possible, especially when you're starting out. Go go slow, because slow is smooth and smooth is fast and fast is hard. And yes. The idea is you learn to throw very relaxed, and because you're relaxed, you'll start to build up speed, because tense muscles are slow muscles, relaxed muscles are fast muscles. And then just because you're going so fast, like you've got enough speed, you're going to hit a lot harder than you would if you really tensed all your muscles and threw yourself in.
And it's exactly the same in sword. So, as I said, my style is renowned for, and a lot of Yajitsu is renowned for extremely fast draws. And, your target area is generally eyes, throat, across the face, soft palate areas, wrists, your major arteries in this area. So you're not aiming to cleave, like the misnomer is you use this big long heavy sword and you just want to cleave like Conan through your opponent. It's not that at all. That you're using the physics of the heavy blade and the long blade to get to the point extremely quickly, and again that becomes a beginner. You can show them and they generally get it, and then they promptly forget it, and they spend years circling back around. You're going, it's a straight line. I'm drawing from here to here, but then I might draw here, I might draw here, I might draw here. So that slow is fast, smooth is fast. It's definitely the same methodology.
And also sort of that just getting, or like understanding that a sword is a cutting object. I mean, and that's something like a lot of the HEMA community have been really quite emphatic about proving, is that European swords, one, were sharp. And two, they are cutting tools. A sword of a one-handed sword, takes very little padding to make it to make it safe to spar with, unless you're hitting like the neck, head, or hands. Two-handed sort of bit more, but still, it's
But that's one of the, as we were talking before about Japanese styles coming into contact or moving into the area. That's the bit that I find hard. Like I watch a lot of HEMA videos, and I, as you said, the development is very interesting. And I love watching. I feel like even though I've only been watching it and not partaking, I can see the evolution of how it's getting more impressive. But one of the hard things for me is because I don't study that system, people look at my system and go, oh my God, that looks terrible, because, they look very outsider looking in. It's the same way. Some of the moves that I see when there's impact, the force generation is different. And obviously some of it comes back to safety and target areas. So I'm trying to figure it out in my world, how I would, safely do what they're doing.
Yeah. I mean, actually with European sword fighting, there is a bit of segregation in terms of training. More so with unarmed martial arts, is you will train specific aspects of what you would need in a fight at different times. So boxing is a really good example because most people are familiar with it. But if you're training to box, you don't want to spar at full strength and full speed every time, because you'll spend more time in hospital, healing injuries, than you will actually training. So when you're sparring, when you've got the gloves on, you're going at quite light speed, maybe, or quite light power, even throwing just quite gentle punches, just to sort of tap your opponent, or maybe give them a bit of a shove if, you want to have a bit of impact to it. But, you're never swinging hard. The time when you swing hard is when when you're hitting the bag, and then the idea being that with adrenaline and having practiced both, they're going to kind of come together, and that does seem to be what happens. Like, there's a lot of people who've done only a small amount of hard sparring going into competition who are still very successful in competition. You go and look at like videos of street fights on YouTube, and you see a lot of boxing technique being not just deployed but successfully deployed in altercations. Like that kind of approach of we can't do everything all at once safely, but we can do we can get a hang of distance and timing and angles in this aspect, and in this aspect we can get the hang of like power and longevity, and then we can sort of bring it together and sort of in some cases like edge closer and have hard sparring. But
in a way that's right, because that comes back to the kata and cutting that we do. Like if anyone watched a video of me doing katas, not many because I don't put them up, but if you watched a video of me, you'd think that I was moving really slow, because competition kata, it's done at 3/4 speed. When I train, so one thing I'm not sure if you're aware of, I've got rheumatoid arthritis, so I'm one of the interesting things about Japanese sword is if you cut the correct angles in Japanese sword, it doesn't hurt because the body mechanics are really good. If you're ever so slightly off, it's quite painful afterwards. You get a lot of tendon injuries, that kind of thing. So when I practice, I have to be very careful. And I practice extremely slowly. So I do kata usually 4 times. And the first time I did very slowly, second time kata speed, third time a little bit faster, and then I go extremely fast, like faster than you would actually do even in combat, I guess, with a shinken as well. And it's to build that body mechanic memory. A lot of our movements come from the base of the spine to the tip of the head. It's twisting motion. So our cuts twist and sink. So if you can see, if you imagine that, it's like a spinning top. So all that rotational energy, if you do it extremely fast, but you've learned to do it with precision, then it's very safe. If you try and do it fast without precision, it's not safe at all.
When you say not safe, as in like you'll
cut yourself. You'll cut yourself. Because you remember, like, so as I said, you start off like basically after a couple of years, you generally, it's accepted you get enough to use a sharp blade to train with. If you draw all of our kata start with a sheath blade, so we don't start at all with them out. You move into postures in some, but quite a lot of them are very quick slashing cuts, which if you do it in the wrong order, you'll probably cut yourself. And a lot of our resheathing activities, as you were saying, with smooth is fast, when you put it in, there's a reverse sheathing, which is lightning quick. It's one of my favorite things to do, but you actually slow it down. And when you think it's fast, it's like an optical illusion. If you watch someone do it, the fast bit is slow and the slow bit is fast. So there's a lot of scope for nicks and slicing.
Okay, just because you're doing everything sort of,
and you don't look, you're not looking when you do it.
Yeah, so it's sort of, you have to put a sword away without like, and I imagine it's more the drawing motions, because I don't know, like, as someone who does a very, very cutting orientated system, I would think it would be very, very unlikely that you would cut yourself. I mean,
I've never cut myself training. I've cut myself cleaning my blade because I got distracted. And there is that, we can't cut a gun barrel with the Japanese sword, but they are generally much sharper because of the shape of the blade and the way that they're polished sharp as opposed to grindstone sharp. I moved literally that much, and I cut down to the bone on my finger.
Oh, wow.
So so you occasionally stab yourself like ever so slightly with the tip, or sometimes with reverse grips you can rotate, because it's only got an edge on one side, you can rotate the back of the tip slightly into the back of your hand if you're not paying attention. That's quite a common beginner's mistake. So it's kind of, you don't really injure yourself madly, but you could, the scope for it, and it's one of those horrible feelings where if you don't injure yourself, but you could see how you could. That's what's quite scary.
Yeah, no, interesting. I mean, like, it's kind of funny you talked about like cutting gun barrels. Things like,
I'd love to, but I can't. No.
Yeah, Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of bits. I mean, actually, was with Western swords. Like, we think of Western swords as being blunt because most of the antique sabers out there are blunt. But the reason they're blunt is because the final sort of polish and the actual sharpen was done by the person using it, so the trooper or the officer.
Yeah.
And they just came from the factory blunt. And most of the antiques out there are swords that went from the factory, or were stored in the factory, or stored in like an armory or something that were never used. But there's like 19th century saber manuals talk a lot about not just sharpening, but different kinds of sharpening. Like there is actually a little bit of a European test cutting tradition, not much.
Like the lead rods and things like that.
Yeah, lead bars, sheep and pig carcasses, apples and scars, or like a lot of them are like there's a lot more sort of like trickery, like not trickery, but like there's kind of a stage trick to it. Like you get a silk scarf and you'd put an apple in it, and then you'd whack the apple, and the silk would be hard enough to not break, but the apple would shatter because it got hit by a sword, and you'd be like, "Oh, look, I cut through the apple without cutting through the scarf." And
I've actually tested that. There's because a lot of the misnomers from Japanese sword come from anime, because anime is great and it's very popular, but a lot of it is obviously not quite, not all of it based in reality. But there is the old. I think it comes from the Mongols, but wearing silk under should be. But from what I gathered, it's actually more about the silk binding around an arrowhead. So I've actually cut a target wrapped in several rounds of silk, and makes no difference whatsoever. It cuts very easily.
I might have to pull out my inner fabric geek and point out that unless you verify that it's actual silkworm silk, which is incredibly rare these days.
It could be. Yeah,
if it's something you got from a fabric store, it's definitely synthetic. Like, I mean, this jacket is meant to be silk lined, but it's it's.
Do you know what this means? It means we have to find some silk and we have to test it again. This is what we have to do.
Yeah, well, we have to find some and proper, authentic, historical silk, because and that's actually that is a thing that is a concern for HEMA. We don't, in some, there's a lot of things that we just can't get anymore. I mean, it's not so bad with 19th century because, the 19th century, was still industrial, not maybe to the same degree. Mixer suggests that we should film this experimentation, which I hardly agree with. But yeah, like that. But then the further back you go, the further back you go, the more different things are. I mean, like this. I guess I first realized this not with sword fighting, but actually with food, where I made like a lot of roast root vegetables, and then discovered that actually carrots are completely different now, because carrots are now large and orange, but they used to be small and purple. And I eventually did track down some heritage carrots, and they taste completely different. They're more like very angry radishes, if that makes sense.
I guess the other issue that HEMA has as well is you might have a supply, say from the 19th century, but the more people that do it, that supply rapidly runs out as well.
Yes.
I mean, that was the issue with Japanese sword. When people first started learning it, they would get guntos from the Second World War, which were, you could go to a flea market and they'd be there. Even I went to an antique market recently and they had wakizashi, which are the smaller, sayak style blades. And they wanted silly money for them. You used to be able to pick them up, and they're just rarer and rarer now as they've been bought up.
Yeah, well, in Australia, the same is true of antique sabers. Like, you can't, my big issue, and if you're from not Australia, like I want you to pay attention. In Australia, we can't get antique sabers easily. You still can in like the UK, Europe, and the US, where there was lots of them in production. But in Australia, they're thousands of dollars. Like, it would be cheaper to buy if I want to do test cutting saber. It would be cheaper just to commission a blacksmith to make me a test cutting sword.
That brings us back to how I started in Japanese sword, or why I was obsessed with it. So as a kid, I grew up in the West Country in the UK, and the West Country, when you go to the beachside towns, there's nothing there. It's the most boring place when you're a kid. But what they do have is lots of antique stores. And I always remember looking in this window at a Japanese gunto and a kukri. There were the two blades, and of course I wanted them, and I wasn't allowed them as a kid, and it stayed with me forever. And here I am now. I've got multiple Japanese blades, but I also have a kukri as well. It was one of the first things I bought, but it was that little seed of seeing it in an antique shop. That's what did it for me.
Yeah, well, wow, that's yeah. I remember growing up with like books about like knights and Vikings and stuff, and yeah, and then I remember in sort of the 90s, you'd start to see samurai as well as as Japan sort of became like a much more important economy and started exporting its culture, and that's also when you get like the anime boom and stuff. But yeah, I think it's kind of a thing where those life experiences kind of play into it. Do you find that like a lot of your students come from like anime fandom or they're into like Kurosawa and ninja films and stuff? Like, does that?
So I'd say the successful ones, all of them enjoy anime, I would say. But the ones, when I say successful, the ones that stick at it, it's like all things, it's not for everyone. You find Japanese sword generally attracts people a little bit older, generally. People that have done other things and they're looking for something different. So I pretty much know nearly all of my students do like anime, but the ones that are, supreme anime fans, when they realize that you don't cut with the reverse edge or, the moves aren't realistic, then they kind of get bored and, it's an entry sort of or gateway to it, I like a little bit of it, but I don't have time to watch it, unfortunately. But every so often, someone will mention one, and I'll look at it and go, "Yeah, that's not too bad."
Yeah, what's kind of thing, and I think that sort of again goes into what we're talking about with like the myth making and stuff. The Japanese like katanas have a huge mythology about them. What are some like are there particular myths that you want to debunk or particular myths that you want to?
My favorite one is the first thing I ever teach someone when they come to the dojo is how to do the Highlander swing. The one-handed swing. And I go, that doesn't work because it's a simple, basic fact. You can swing the sword and do the reverse with a closed hand. Everyone always opens their fingers to do it. The correct way is to actually bend your elbow in and maintain that rotation. So it's a good little entree. But the thing that really, when you see a film, someone with a samurai sword and they attack multiple opponents and they're hitting multiple things, unfortunately, the blade of a Shinken, it will just chip. So they weren't designed. In fact, when they went to war, they would dull the blade slightly. So you would have your beautiful sharp sword. And remember, it was a sidearm. It wasn't an actual prime weapon, but they would hammer the edge into a pile of sand just to take that extra sharp edge off so that it would bind more because they would be fighting people in armor. So if you're on the street, then you're only wearing like your day clothes. Yeah, a sharp sword's cool. If you're using it as a sidearm, you've broken your spear, everything else is gone. You don't want something that's going to chip and probably shatter. So you take the edge off slightly so that it binds into the lacquer of the armor of the person you're fighting.
I think it becomes a bit more jagged. Yeah, it's interesting. So I guess back to what I was saying about like the myth that European swords weren't sharp. One of the things they talk about in the 19th century is, and something Alfred Hutton famously said is, he reckons that unless you're doing like trick cuts, like not trick cuts, like the display cutting where you're cutting carcasses and lead bar. Actually, lead bars you want a very different sword to what you want for cutting a carcass.
Yeah.
But he reckons that your sword should be sharp, but you should be able to get a magnifying glass and look at the blade under a magnifying glass, and it should look like a saw blade. So it should have like it should still be a bit jagged.
Like micro serrations,
Yeah. And he says because if you do that, it will bite into clothing and leather and things like that. Whereas if it's too sharp, he reckons it struggles with harder materials. So it's kind of interesting, that sort of similarity there.
It comes down to how you cut as well. So when you cut targets, they're generally vertical, but there's a type of cutting called dodangiri, which is or futomaki, like big sushi rolls. So you roll the targets until you end up with a giant fat mat. The biggest I've done is a 2 format rolls. So you're talking the width of a soccer ball, but arranged, and they're usually just below waist height. So the manuals say that your blade's sharp and you can just use a perfect arc and it will cut through. It's like hitting concrete. These used mats are so hard. You actually have to do the reverse. So when you cut in, and then as you impact, you actually have to push away from yourself because it won't slice. The target is too dense and too heavy for your slice to actually, your forearms aren't that strong. So you get to a certain point, and then you actually use your hips and your back to push the sword forward again, and then that gives you an extra level of cutting.
Okay, wow. So just, really...
But it does hurt. You can't do many of those cuts. It really is like hitting concrete when you...
Yeah. So, because that sounds like, that doesn't sound necessarily like the sort of thing you do in combat, like just, slamming down something.
So that one's an old style blade test. So, when you'd be hitting like a pile of clay or lead bars, that's more of the testing the sword rather than the person.
Okay,
Push cuts. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll get next question up just because I think it relates. So you're talking about a push cut. Do you use push cuts, pull cuts, or your normal?
Depends on the technique. So most of the beginners cuts that you learn will be the best way to explain it. I don't know if you've ever seen Chinese hook swords, with the long hook at the end. So the best way to be able to visualize how to cut a target, if you're aiming, target area is neck, is cut past your opponent and hook back. So you cut as full extension and then let your body pull. So it's a pull cut in that frame. But of course, if you're doing a kiriagi, which is a diagonal upwards cut, you're actually pushing and pulling at the same time. So that's where, it looks like a simple cut, but you have to hit the target and then you push with the hips. So most Japanese sword cutting is done with the hips, which is confusing. But it's just back to body mechanics. So you hit the target, which is slicing as a pull, and then you actually push through with your hips, and then you pull back. So you want to pull back to get your arms back into the next position, but also for safety, so you don't damage yourself at the same time.
Okay, yeah, and sort of... But
Kendo cuts, they're push cuts. So when they do men cut, in the old days when they actually used to fight, you would see a lot of them wear the I can't remember what it's called, but it's like a silk scarf with a piece of steel or iron inside it. That was to protect against the push cut. So you would come in and push, and this bleeds like nothing. If you get cut or if you hit your head anywhere here, it bleeds into your eyes. So it's a very good technique to learn.
Yeah, actually there was in Sabers, like when Sabers were used for riot control, which actually that was done well into the 20th century. I mean, there's film footage of it. But one of the techniques was you'd throw a push cut, like just a number of like so dead vertical cut, but push with a sort of angle, so that you're not getting anywhere near enough power to actually break bone. But you just smack straight through the person's skull, and because the force is coming forward, their head gets thrown back, they get disorientated, and then they're in a lot of pain and bleeding really, really heavily. The idea was that would sort of disincentivize them from wanting.
And it comes back to sparring as well. So especially when you learn, you don't tend to do it on our paired sword versus sword just because of the blade type. But when we do sword versus spear, you actually push and pull. The Japanese blade is diamond shaped and the Japanese spear is triangle shaped. So you actually engage the spear with the back edge of your blade, and you're against it's your blunt edge against the sharp edge of one of the spearheads. So as they move, you feel the vibration through your sword, and that's when you either go under or above their spear. Because with sword versus spear, the technique is to get as close as possible inside, away from the dangerous bit. So that's one of the triggers.
Okay, yeah. So actually like a sensory trigger, right? Or like a touch trigger rather than a sight sort of thing. Okay. So I've got another question, I think, which does relate to cutting. Mm-hmm. So when you're cutting the mat, I'm assuming the target mat, not cutting yourself.
Yeah. Well, it depends how good I am. Yeah.
do you go through a complete technique waza, and the final cut is the impact, or are you just purposely cutting and practicing the cut itself?
Both. So you initially start to learn how to cut. So that obviously is repetition. So you want to do the same cut over and over, combinations of those cuts, like opposite directions. If I'm doing competition, so our competitions, we do individual cutting, individual kata, paired kata, and team cutting. Team cutting is like if you're talking about putting the pressure on people. So going back to the individual cutting, at my level, so I'm fifth dan. The group that I'm in, it's usually separated first dan and second dan, third dan and fourth, and then fifth and above. You have your divisions. So we do cutting from kata, but it becomes very hard because the target doesn't move. So you have to modify the kata into that cut. And the other issue that I have is I'm very tall, like I'm 6'1", 183, I think. The target stands in Japan are designed for short Japanese people, and that's not. They are all way shorter than most of us Westerners. So I used to train with a higher stand, and I realized it was pointless because when I go to Japan for the competition, I've got to cut lower. So as a beginner, you only have to cut 3 times, 4 times. I've got to cut 6 cuts, and you have a spike with a red rubber band, which is about here. You can't cut below that. And several times I've had to fail purposely in the competition because I can't get another cut out of the target. That's, so I've done 5 of the 6 cuts, but I can't do it. But the team cutting is very good. That's a great way of a beginner winning competition. So you have 3 members of your team. First person does 2 cuts, 1, 2. Second person does 1, 2, so down and up. And the last person does down and then horizontal. So the person who's in charge is the third cut because that's the hardest. And most people have 1 cut, which is their best side. What usually happens, and it's great because everyone gets really stressed about it because you win. This one's for a cup, so it's a very prestigious thing to win. The person who goes first gets the order wrong, so he cuts from the wrong side, which then and then the second person makes a mistake, and you get all this. It's like a waterfall of stress all the way down to the last cut. So yeah, it's those ones are not from kata; they're from set positions, but it's more freestyle.
Okay, so you're you're doing. So you don't necessarily know what you're going to be cutting beforehand. Like you sort of, you go in and you've got a bit of spontaneity.
And it's one of those things like when you say how can they judge. What's very common in the second cut is the first person will make a mistake. The second person will do a beautiful second cut, and they'll go, okay, I've done this. I need to leave enough mat above the spike for the third person. And they either miss completely or they take way too much off because of the stress. And of course, then that filters down to the next person. So they make a mistake, but you can recover and win by what we call zanshin. So, when we cut, we have this nice blank visage, very calm. A lot of people get flustered. They can't do it. If you do it well, your scoring goes up. So.
Yeah, except the thing I was watching on the rules of Kendo a while back, and it was saying the similar sort of concept in Kendo. You're not supposed to show emotion. It's you go out, you hit, you sit back down. It's almost the opposite of Olympic fencing, where you're meant to get as excited after an exchange as possible. So yeah, is that a big part of it as well? Is being physically calm on the outside?
So I've kata identical. Yeah, if you've done really good kata, you can usually do three sets when you're competing, because obviously there's a time window like bouting. Usually you've done well in kata when you end up back at the beginning and you can't remember what you've done because you've just gone through it effortlessly and it's really good. Cutting, I've not won, but I've jumped places, and this is not not talking myself up, but just maintaining zanshin, and it's the principle behind it. I had 5 cuts. On my 4th cut, I got stuck because I've been in Japan training all week. I was sore, I was tired, and they put that nasty combo in where you didn't have any kinetic energy, and I got stuck. Now, a lot of people, they're like, very angry, whatever. Maintain zanshin. I disemboweled the target by pulling it out, and I completed the set of cuts. So I only did 5 or 4 out of the 5. Someone who did 5 but got had a very messy style of cutting, showed a lot of emotion, they lost points.
Yeah.
Because it's there. It's supposed to represent, you can't be psyched out, and also if you're injured or you get cut in a fight, you don't show it. Obviously, a lot of it is quite esoteric and difficult to imagine nowadays, but that's kind of the principle behind it.
Yeah, so it's almost like that Zen thing as well of control. So when you train, so you've talked all about, like, you've got test cutting, you've got kata, which obviously both of which are developing like the technique of actually,
Yes.
Doing damage. Do you ever get into things? Do you ever look at things like judging distance or manipulating distance between your opponent, or like timing? Like, I mean, you do
Yeah.
talk about being
Yeah.
very fast at all. So how does what you do approach that?
So in Japanese style, it's something called mai, which is a really weird word. It's M-A. I can't even spell it. It's weird. So it means distance, timing, and arriving at that point. So it's equivalent of finding a gap. So if you're ready to strike someone, they raise their sword. It's your ability to be able to close that distance and hit the correct point at the correct time without being hit yourself. I mean, you would see it in kendo, like really experienced fast kendo people, like very high level. It's a blur of motion, but if you actually watch it at low speed, you can see that where there's a slight pause and then it's all over. So that it's that control, distance, and application of technique all in one motion.
Okay, yes, sort of. I mean, I guess the equivalent concept in European fencing would be time. Time and counter time.
So I do know this. I remember talking to Paul once because I believe in European style you cut in, or what I do is classed as false time. Is that correct?
Probably yes. It's been a long time since I've done Elizabethan sort of, like, the concept of true and false times is something you see in Elizabethan sort of play and into sort of the early Enlightenment, and then it completely disappears. Like in 19th century, what I do, the only references to it are people going, "Oh, hey, I found this old manuscript that talks about these things called true times." But yeah, in 19th century, like post-Enlightenment fencing, including modern Olympic fencing, when we talk about time and counter time, timing your opponent is where you go at the right moment to hit a weakness,
Yes.
and counter timing is where you present a false weakness to get your opponent to go, so that then you can time hit them.
So we do both. So
Yeah.
when I talk about our paired kata with the sword and spear and sword versus sword, so one of the issues we have, because of the point being so dangerous, you have that pause, counter move. If you do it's really difficult to explain without showing it. But basically, when you do it, when you teach, the more experienced person loses, which means that the more experienced person is at risk of getting hit on the head or stabbed with the sharp bit, because it's difficult to control, and you have to learn how to get to that timing. So, and once you understand it and you reverse the roles, you understand, because you get to that point where if you don't get your timing right, which would be the technique, you automatically get hit. There's nothing you can do to avoid it. So, and for a lot of people, it's quite psychologically difficult, because you spend a lot of time doing kata on your own, and you know the distance and you figure it out. Once you start doing it against someone, especially with a spear, like I did a demo a couple of years ago, and I nearly didn't do it because the ground was very uneven. So even though the spear is not razor sharp, it's still got a sharp point and it masses a lot of energy. And the strike point again is here. So I was a bit worried about that pause motion and getting into the right position, stumbling upon the grass. It was quite scary.
Yeah.
But again, once you get into that mindset, it works, because if you hesitate too much, that's when you're in trouble. If you hesitate in the right position, wait for the opening and move, it's very safe.
Yeah, and so it's almost about like learning how to sort of visually identify those kinds of triggers.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Well, so does interesting. I mean, I know what you mean about the whisk of the spear. one of the thing was probably like the final nail in the coffin for me with metal weapons reenactment was at an event someone took it was actually like a fully blunt spear with a rounded head, so as round as like a 20-cent piece. So quite blunt, like as blunt as you can get a metal object without just having like a metal bar. Someone got thrust in the face with one of those and was carted off to hospital.
Yeah.
Mostly because it's like, unless you make your spearhead very, very long, it's actually very, very hard to design spearheads with enough flex to be safe. Like then this is a problem with I'm doing spear and HEMA.
And you know what?
It's flexible ones.
It's kind of the elephant in the room, I think. Where it's not being arrogant of the art to say that's why we struggle to do contact. Everyone who's probably trained more than a couple of years will have always encountered something that was really scary, like a blade to the face, or, I've had friends cut themselves quite badly, and you have to reassess, and you realize that, yes, whilst we're doing it or studying an anachronistic art, it's still bloody dangerous. There's multiple times when people, yourself or other people, can get injured. So it's healthy to have that in the back of your mind. It shouldn't be fear. Respect is the term. And it is. It doesn't happen very often, but complacency is the thing that you have to worry about. As you say, if something happens and if you can't understand why it happened, that's the biggest red flag. Accidents happen and situations happen, but if you can't understand why, then you shouldn't train.
Yeah, like if you're not sure, like what, or like, especially if you can't go forward and then try and prevent it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very, very big on hand protection because I once had a finger broken, and also like there are certain simulators I don't like using because when I was training with them, I'd miss at least one night a month of training because I was just too injured. So yeah, like it's I get where you're coming from with that sort of respect for the weapon, and then but you sort of and you then have to sort of counterbalance that by making with having the activity sort of be safe enough that people want to do it.
And then it becomes like a seesaw. Like you have to accept risk and you have to make it safe. And it's definitely it's what makes it an effective art, I believe. If there is risk, there's obviously some value to it. And it's how far you can take it to the safety layer before it stops becoming. That's where Kendo is now. Kendo has removed many of the strikes that they used to have. I think there's only 3 left, and one of them you can't do until you're a certain experience level. So it's different to what it was.
Yeah, it sort of becomes like foil fencing is. Foil fencing went through that sort of about 200, a bit over 200 years ago, where people wanted to be able to spar at speed, and this is before the invention of fencing masks. So they limited the target to just the torso, and then they also introduced rules about who got the point in the case of a double, which was, I suspect, a lot more to do with gambling than a lot of HEMA practitioners and fencers would like to admit. But yeah, like it's the same sort of thing where you get this very, very abstract art, and then with foil fencing about 100 years later, when people are fighting duels, there are a lot of people who turn around and said, hang on, like this is not an actual simulation of an actual encounter. This is not simulating a fight. This is, it's a good thing to do, and it's a good fun sport, but experienced foil fencers were were losing duels to people with almost no training, which is where we get épée fencing from. There was a then big push to create something that was a very strong simulation of a duel. I don't know, has there ever been like a similar move in Japanese swordsmanship, or is it sort of like, I get what you were saying before actually with Kendo is those developments in Kendo are fairly recent, but yeah.
It's hard to tell because it's not secretive, because it's a secret if I'm not a native Japanese speaker, so I glean information from people when I'm over there. Even in my style systems, certain kata have been dropped, ways of doing things have changed. It just happens. Seems to be more organic over there. And again, we're drifting away so long from when anyone ever used a sword. So they have the lineage, and they have, a lot of the systems go back to 1400, and there's an unbroken lineage. But you will still get that drift of, you can only train as a trainer. You can't train as someone that actually does it, for real. So
Yeah.
it's a constant battle with that.
Yeah, and there doesn't really seem. I guess the thing with a lot of Japanese swordsmanship is there's not the same emphasis on simulation that you see. Well, actually, no, European swordsmanship has. This goes back to sort of like epee, and I mean, Sabers always had kind of a big emphasis on like actually simulating a duel. But in Japanese swordsmanship, there doesn't seem to be as much kind of an approach, or like I guess an emphasis on going, okay, well, we're not actually going to fight, but we're going to do something that is kind of like fighting. Like
you do find bouts. Like I've bouted in Japan, but it's more. I guess the design of most of the systems, so because it was a sidearm and it was not the principal weapon of combat. It is very niche for what it is. If you think how popular Japanese swords are in the world, it's it's the equivalent to Colt 45. It's a sidearm weapon. So when you used it, it was very much quick. Like most of the techniques, and going back to myths and things. Like I love watching a lot of the modern movies, the really well made ones. But you watch it and you're just like, oh my god, because they fight. There's constant clashing of swords and impact. In reality, both opponents would die, or one would die and one be really badly injured. That's how quick the moves were. So it's kind of it's a bit like spot fighting. You could do it, but it's hard to do.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I guess also like you sort of have to be realistic about it. I mean, I guess which goes back to the movie thing as well, and I mean, it's the same with any sort of sword tradition. There's there's people are getting their ideas about how this works from movies, which are made primarily to be entertainment. And then, really, one thing I want to do is actually interview a stage fence that actually talk through just how different stage fencing needs to be from martial arts, because there's just so like every time I talk to a stage fencer or even like an actor who's trained stage fencing, the considerations for them about like, how do you get someone who's had, an hour's preparation on the day of filming to look good? How do you make sure that, there's just no chance of injury? How do you how do you tell, and then stuff like, how do you tell a story and stuff like that? It's just, the context and considerations are so incredibly different. Like I tend to be more impressed when you see movies that actually start to get things right, because like to do that would take an incredible effort on the part of multiple people. But like I think it still does have an impact. Though. Like you still do get those myths coming through. I mean, like I guess Japanese swordsmanship is a bit more notorious for it. Like you were saying before about like sort of like katanas cutting through gun barrels, and
I guess as well. If you think about it, the history of Japanese sword is probably the same as the history, of probably back to like 13th century European sword. So you've got a big variance in. So I said I use the heavy blade, so my blade is more like Nambujuku era, which is the biggest, heaviest type of weapon you would have as a sword. Whereas Seitei, they use much lighter swords from pre-Meiji, which are that's what they're designed to do. They're very light. They're designed to be quick. So mine's quick, but you have to learn how to move it quick, whereas theirs was designed specifically to be quick.
Okay, like sort of like as sort of like a civilian context weapon or something. Because I guess going back to the sidearm kind of analogy that everyone uses for swords, I mean the most common the most common use for really hundreds of years has been as a civilian arm, like people carry a pistol in self-defense. I mean, in some parts of the world where it's legal to do so, and occasionally where it's not, people still carry pistols for self-defense. You don't really see people carrying like assault, or carrying rifles or muskets for self-defense. So did Japanese swordsmanship, or did Japanese swords have the same thing where you have lighter ones that were used in peacetime, or like and then heavier ones for war, or
Pretty much, yeah. Like, because if you're in a situation where you're fighting armored opponents, you can't, you're nice. And it also, as well, you wouldn't take your really expensive, like your Ferrari sword, where it's got beautiful gold inlaid everything. Unless you're a general, you wouldn't be having one of those. It'd be simple steel furniture on the blade. Um, I do joke sometimes because I'm tall and a lot of my students are short. Sometimes I'll swap swords and pick their sword up, and I'm like, this would be my city blade. This is the one I'd be carrying around town because it's really short and fast. It's nice. So yeah, it again as well. Some of it comes back to the class code. The samurai class were a class, and it was a class-based society. So the swords were the emblem of the class, so they had to carry them. So I'm not hugely au fait with the historical reasons behind it, but that was definitely one of the badges of being a samurai.
Yeah, it was carrying swords.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you see actually, there's a you see you see the same thing in Europe. Although in Europe there's like fewer restrictions on sword ownership and sword wearing most of the time. In some cases, like in France, there were like if you weren't an aristocrat, you couldn't wear a sword. But amongst the well-to-do who would wear swords for fashion, you get the development of the small sword, which, amongst many other virtues, is very, very light and easy to wear. And there is a wonderful description by a guy named Samuel Pepys, who basically wrote this really, really detailed diary of his life. Like he, basically just sort of would go home of a day and sort of write down all of his thoughts from the day, which is this great historical record. But he talks about the effort and thought he puts into buying a sword. None of the considerations are martial. This is a man who does not know how to, by his own admission, does not know how to fence. And but he goes out and he gets this sword, and it's very important that he gets a very nice, stylish sword. And then I think it's like 2 months or so later, he talks about how he was attacked by a wild dog in the streets of London. So that was like a feral dog. That was the thing that happened. And he says it wasn't until he got home that he even remembered that he was wearing a sword. But that's probably for the best, because if he tried to fight this dog with a sword, he would have looked quite foolish for not knowing how to use it. But yeah, that seems to be a thing. Is if you're wearing a sword every day for whatever reason, you tend to want it to be lighter. That's where the Western tradition of having like very, very light swords, like small swords, comes from.
Well, yeah, like I said, whereas mine's quite heavy, the way that the sword is carried through the obi with blade up, you don't actually feel it after a while. It's so comfortable in that position. It doesn't hang or slap against your thigh or anything like that. You have to obviously worry about hitting someone with the end of the saya, but you can literally it's one of the most comfortable things. It's weird, but coming back to sword weight and handleability as well, the one thing I've noticed by training with other people and picking up other people's swords, which you always ask first, of course, but if I gave you my sword, you might go, oh, it feels a bit strange, but it feels like a sword. And if I picked up one of yours, it might be lighter, more heavy, it should still feel like a weapon. That's the main difference. It doesn't really matter on the weight or the length, it's how it feels in the hand. I think that's universal across any style. If it doesn't feel like a weapon, then it's no good as a weapon.
Yeah, it's a thing. That's actually the thing I've noticed. Like the difference between handling, like the katanas used for test cutting, and like the ones used by actual martial arts practitioners, and then the ones you get at anime expos and stuff. Even if they look similar, they feel incredibly different in the hand. And I've had arguments with people who've made a lot of generalizations about katanas, and I'm like, hang on, this comes across like you having handled one that you got, you got like at a pop culture expo that was next to like a Conan sword, and I remember once picking up like a 300 sword at a Supernova years and years ago, and it would have weighed about 3 kilo, and it's a sword about this big. It's very, very short and very, very heavy, and I'm just like, and the guy who was selling it asked me how I felt, and I'm like, it feels a bit heavy. He goes, oh, but they were big guys. I'm like, yeah, but.
Well, I've like I said, I've been successful in come first in cutting competitions, but I hamstring myself. Like I don't use. Some people have special grind or special edge geometries for cutting. I use the same blade for training that I use for cutting that I use for anything. Yeah, I don't like to differentiate between the two. Admittedly, I do have a very heavy blade in Japan, but that was a gift. So I can take my Japanese made sword here into Japan, but it's a hassle, very much so. It's not, Japanese swords are licensed, so mine's not licensed to be in Japan unless I take it back for repair. But generally, yeah, I don't see the point in training with a blade that is any different to what you would use in, the context of what you're training.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that, that's kind of I mean, I guess that's also a thing as well when we start talking about like simulators. This is one thing I found really interesting looking at the history of training weapons is the idea that a training weapon should be or should be like a one-to-one kind of copy, except safe of an actual war weapon is a fairly recent thing. In gymnasium, in Britain, gymnasium sabers, so the standard saber that the military had for fencing practice, were completely different to all of the different types of sabers and cutlasses that the army was issuing. I think like the Navy, I know certainly the American Navy, when they trained with single sticks they used were the same length as a cutlass.
Yeah.
But it was really interesting that they were, they'd still quite happily use in some cases, very different weapons. I mean, sticks were very commonly used as a substitute for swords. Like, you go out and you do essentially stick fighting until and it was a much more recent thing that people are saying, hang on, the tools we use for training need to be similar to the tools we use for fighting. I don't know if that because
it's the other way around in Japan. You would always non or training type blades are relatively new. They would use pretty much the same blades that they would use on a day-to-day basis, more for affordability and just being able to get them. Then you do have the struggle of trying to get them to be within the same weight range, a couple 100 grams difference. And the taller you are, the more expensive it is. So, I'm very lucky. I've got a beautiful handmade sword that was made for me, but it cost way more than someone who was 6 inches shorter than me. And they could buy, not off the shelf, but the swordsmith in Japan had ready-made swords of that length, whereas mine is a non-standard length. So even my training sword, which is blunt, cost about $300-400 more than a standard one because you just pay extra.
Okay, yeah, and you sort of. So is it that they you pay per inch or whatever?
Well, so polishing a sword like Japanese style swords, you pay someone to make it for you. You pay someone to make all the furniture, the handle and everything else. One guy makes the crossguard, and then you pay someone to polish it. So mine have a cutting polish, which is shiny, but it's not super shiny. To have an art polish where that's a museum grade polish to go on a wall. It's it used to be, I don't know what it is now, but it used to be about $150, $160 per inch. My sword's 31 inches long on the blade, so it adds up very rapidly if you and if you had it polished like that, you can't cut with it because if you did, it would just ruin it.
It ruins the polish.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, so I'm getting the impression, particularly with Japanese swords, collecting and collectors are also a big kind of part. I don't know about how many of them sort of cross over into actually using the swords.
Very rare. I ended up Sydney Tokenkai, the main Japanese sword collectors group in Australia. I asked them if they wanted, I could do a demo, and they were like, "Why would you use a sword?" They'd it's almost diverged, object art to object of martial arts. So yeah, there's definitely very few. I mean, people. As I say, the correct number of swords is N+1 for most practitioners. But yeah, so I don't put my swords up on the wall. For me, they're training objects. But different strokes for different folks.
Yeah, no. Well, it's sort of. I mean, I guess there was kind of a similar thing in early HEMA, back in sort of, the mid to late 90s, there was a belief that you would never, or that you parried with the flat of your sword, because if you smacked two swords together, the blades could chip. It's not, they don't chip every time, but and the chipping has become rarer and rarer as people have gotten better at making swords, but this still happens. And then that actually affected people's interpretation of the manuals, where people are looking at, this must be with the flat because they wouldn't want to damage their sword, and then when you actually try it out and bout it doesn't work, because parrying with the flat is often not biomechanically optimal most of the time. And then there are the manuals that specifically say to parry with that. They don't usually say parry with the edge. What they say is either this is the edge you're parrying with, or do this to make sure that you meet the sword with the edge.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a very, very different sort of mindset.
So that's something that I was interested in, where you have, a lot of the HEMA schools, they have manuals, but the lineage was broken, whereas in Japan you've got an extant lineage. But the issue you have is the mistranslation and misinterpretation of stuff. So same kind of thing, where there's a full lineage of, they understand why it was done, but you still get a lot of people that can't transmit that information correctly, so that you might end up a similar style does things completely differently because they misinterpreted what their original instructor told them to do. But it's very easy to do. Yeah,
well, and also I see this myself just teaching people. Kinesthetic or transmission of kinesthetic knowledge is really, really difficult. And when you have essentially an oral history, most actual oral histories, there's a lot of effort put into making sure a person can repeat the historical record perfectly, but that becomes harder when you've got people of different body shapes or different physicalities. You get, this is a thing that you see. You actually see it in the sources for when you get mostly post-enlightenment, when you're getting a lot of sources, old bookshops now, and find the odd fencing manual from sort of 1900 or so. You see people who've all learnt the same system, who, when they write down what they do, or they write their manual 20 years later, are doing slightly different things. And that is just,
that happens.
So,
so we have competition, right? When you say how important is it to go to Japan, one of the interesting things is when I go for the training. The competition is at the end, which is a nice little cherry on the cake. And in my age and my skill bracket, I'm competing against friends from America, South Africa, England, and Australia, and Japan. But there's a drift, even with the internet and modern, the dojos each have their, heads, and they've all learnt at different times, and that transmission of knowledge is delayed. So when we get to the competition, so I'm training at a different dojo to where the competition is held. I always go the night before to train at the home dojo so I can see what everyone else is doing. So there's what I learned previously. There might be a slight disconnect. It's not wrong. It's just they may not have updated with the current methodology. So you just watch, and then you watch the judges, and then you learn how to game the judges. That's part of the the hey-ho or the strategy of learning. And they do it. They make changes not to make it difficult for people. It's to keep it living, to make sure that you can react, because the kata is just it's like when you used to make model planes as a kid. You get your kit and all the pieces. That's all the kata is. It's just a framework. As you said, I don't do a lot of sparring, but I do a lot of solo, experimentation and body movement. And you notice that you can immediately do something because you've got that toolkit. You can step off and go completely off what you've done before, but everything just, it has a flow to it. As you said, it's that mind space that you can move into.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, and you sort of built up like that, I guess for what I term like a movement vocabulary, where you actually have,
One of our very seniors, he takes video of every year of all of the competition, and he goes through it piece by piece, and he sees the thing that people are stuffing up on, and then he'll change the kata for the next year just to make sure that people get it right. And then it might change back, or it might change again. So it's the framework is always there. We call it a rectangle. You as long as you're within that rectangle. Like I'm very tall and quite overweight, unfortunately, and I train people that are very short and very fit. So as long as your movement is within that rectangle, that's fine. If you're outside the rectangle, it's not fine. You've got to move in.
Yeah. Yes, you sort of have to account for some variance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, we're starting to get some questions in from the audience, so I might start answering some of those. So, Liz wants to know, what books or manuscripts would you recommend for learning Japanese swordsmanship? And I think that's the spear, not the spar.
Oh yeah. Well, so the bad answer is none, because that's the official answer. There are plenty of books out there. I mean, what you'll find, most of the books will have ways of doing it which are slightly off. There's a thing in Japanese technique called okujin technique where there's hidden. So it will show you how to do something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that's the 100% effective way of doing it. Probably, I'm trying to think. I tend not to read many books because I train more than I read. I read for other things. Katori Shinto-ryu, Tenshin Shoden Katori Shinto-ryu is probably the most famous sword and spear system. There's probably, I know there's good books on that. Learning it's quite difficult. Mick Parker.
Yep, I'll put it up on screen just so everyone can see.
So Toyama Ryu is a bit like Linux. It's open source. Anyone can teach Toyama Ryu. That's just the 7 kata that was originally formulated. What Obata teaches is Shinkendo, new Kendo. So he's taken Shinkendo, taken other systems and put it into his. He was actually a student of of the founder of my style, and he moved to America and went his own way. So there's some similarities there.
Okay, yeah. And, well, actually, begs probably something I was been meaning to ask. When you talk about like similarities and differences, how big is this? How big is kind of the body of Japanese swordsmanship? Like, is it so big that someone who is not familiar with Japanese swordsmith systems could look at 2 different practitioners and go, yep, they're doing something very different? Or is it the case that until you're sort of immersed within it, until you don't really see the differences?
No, I reckon you could. It's a sad thing. There's not as many as there used to be, but there's still probably over 200 different styles of individual arts, and then you've got the sub-styles as well. I mean, Eishin-ryu is the largest Japanese system, and there's probably about 5 or 6 different groups that do different. They've splintered over the years or moved away from each other. I know if I look at HEMA videos, and I can't really tell you the difference between Fiore or other styles, but I can see the weapon type. I guess that's probably the main difference in Japanese sword, is because the sword is the same. I don't know. You could probably pick it, I reckon, because the movements, because it's very economic in movement, they're quite distinct. Some may look similar because they might be related, but there's definitely a way of to the naked eye you could see the difference.
Okay, yeah, and so the untrained person. Okay, interesting. Yeah. For reference, if what the person's doing is really, really angry, it's Fiore. If it's a little calmer, it's probably something else.
That sounds a bit like my system then, because I like the concept of kiai in Japanese style. I'm originally from England. I'm quite soft spoken. It took me a long time to develop the kiai. It comes from your belly, solar plexus, all the way up. I'm supposedly renowned for having a very strong kiai now, which is good. But yeah, it's took me a long time to get to that point.
Yeah, to develop it, and the loudness.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Also, that's a thing as well. Like sometimes with when I was looking at the history of Kendo and a lot of the Japanese arts is kiai and the yelling. Part of that is also psychological because you're creating a lot of noise, and the idea is basically it is done as like a training thing, so there's a lot of noise and discord and stuff to, basically try and scare the other person.
But also it's breathing as well,
Hmm.
because it relaxes your diaphragm. So as you shout or kiai, it puts all the muscles in the right position. So when I train, I do silent kiai. I don't, because I'm quietly spoken. I hate noise. So you do that. You go through the same motions. You breathe the same way, and then you can dial it up to 11 if you need to after that.
Yeah, that's the shouting begins. Yeah, no, fair. And interesting, sort of like interesting approaches to like all, sort of interesting how it kind of like that living tradition is kind of continued on. I mean, there are. I mean, it's kind of interesting actually. Like, it's a big problem for HEMA is there are living lineages and living traditions in European martial arts. And like, there are fencing schools that can trace the history all the way back to the Renaissance. I mean, we had, like there are people who are doing HEMA now who did Olympic fencing, learned from a coach that learned from like Alfred Hartnell or John Musgrave-Waite and stuff like that. The problem for HEMA is that all of the living traditions are now Olympic fencing. So we're with this thing where it's like, well, there are living lineages of European sword fighting, some of which go back a very, very long way. But those lineages are not doing what was done even like 100 years ago, which, is I don't know, I find that a very, very interesting thing. Whereas in Japan, like, I know there seems to have been a very, very concerted effort to preserve those traditions and go, all right, well, we're going to do it this one. We're going to try and keep it as similar as possible. Like,
well, they're classed as cultural. They're cultural artifacts. The schools are, especially the older ones. Yeah, the heads of the styles are national living treasures. That's how they're classified in Japan. So
wow.
it's very much ingrained in the culture there. They respect and venerate the past, and that's, if you're a member of one of those really old schools, then that's why some people think that a lot of Japanese arts are a bit snooty. It's not. It's because the honor factor is there. The fact that you're allowed to train in that system is a big thing.
Yeah, like it's sort of a long-standing tradition. Does that differ between sort of like card-orientated sort of arts like what you do and things like, say, Kendo and Judo, which are combat sports? Like,
kind of. I don't know. I don't really have much experience with them. I believe. I mean, there's definitely older, systems of Judo and such. You did. I can't speak on their behalf, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah. Because it's sort of it's. I mean, it's a thing that's always really interested me. Because I mean, in here we get this. I get asked a lot about, is what you're doing, is it a martial art or just a sport? And I'm like, well, in like a European context, those are not really that distinct. Like, in particularly like, and particularly in like the British tradition, most, if not all, martial arts, and certainly the ones that are regarded as the most effective are always the ones that have like a strong sportive tradition. So the best fighters were the people who were the best prize fighters. Because they were the ones who were really honing their skill through competition. Whereas, like in Japan, there seems to be a really, really strong distinction that I don't know. I find a lot of people try to sort of project onto other martial arts traditions and say, there's whereas like in European martial arts, there's like the earliest I've seen any idea that something that is a sport is not also combative is actually World War II, where you started seeing militaries training, or like training their soldiers in hand-to-hand fighting that either specifically emphasized dirty fighting or like specifically emphasized unorthodox techniques.
Yeah, that makes sense.
but yeah, before then not so much. Whereas Japan, how long is that sort of? Do you know how long that like that tradition of the or a division between like sort of sportive and I guess traditional or like cultural martial arts? Do you know how long that's been around, or is that?
I think I don't know exactly, but I would say it's probably around, I don't know. So sumo, that's it's a gambling sport, even though it's very traditional. There's
Mm,
a lot of money involved in sumo, so
mm,
it's probably around that point where it became, something that money could be made from.
mm,
Those sports started to change somewhat, and after the war as well. Obviously, the Japanese were banned from a lot of martial arts practice for obvious reasons.
mm,
So the more do-based arts, the sports-based or
mm,
less combative became. When we say combative, I mean still fighting arts like judo, but the judo as opposed to jujitsu
mm.
became more popular.
Yeah, like it's sort of yeah, you're doing like you're saying no, this is definitely a sport. This is not like this is not combat training at all. I mean, I
Yeah,
guess like with judo, it's going to be very different because by like I mean by like the 19 by even like the 1900s and 1910s, judo was everywhere. Like the sort of I guess there's sort of a discussion that no one really wants to have in HEMA about, well, where does judo and jiu-jitsu fit in? Because, you know, even in like the late 1800s, like the 1890s, um, jiu-jitsu has become a very, very important martial art in a lot of European countries. I mean,
yeah,
famously the suffragettes all studied jiu-jitsu, to defend themselves and cause mischief. It was like it was apparently up until World War II, judo was really really popular in Australia as well.
yeah,
And it sort of
yeah.
died off and came back in like I think the 70s and 80s a bit. Um, but yeah, you're going to see a difference there. Whereas like the that might also be why kendo is so sort of buttoned down in terms of technique now. Is it, you know
I think it
um,
depends as well. Like in America, sword systems, like Japanese sword systems, are mainly based in military areas because military from the US who are based in Japan, they take it back. Whereas what I
mm,
found in Australia and England is that the kendo usually goes to, or it started off at a university with an exchange student, and then
mm,
a club would develop and more students would come, and then eventually someone would say, oh, I also know how to do traditional Japanese sword, would you like to learn that? So
mm.
the centers of the sword are slightly different in the different countries.
Okay.
Australia and England are much more similar than America
Mm.
with that regard.
Yeah, well, and America, I mean, still has bases in Japan today, so
Yeah, yeah.
there's still
Well,
like
so the main base in outside of Tokyo, which is now called Camp Zama,
mm.
where the head of our style outside of Japan was based, is actually the original Toyama Military Academy, where the name comes from. So they
Oh
changed the
wow,
name. Yeah, so it's the site is still there.
oh wow, and yeah, and they've still got people doing sword fighting, or like
Yeah,
not yeah, like actually doing like practicing swordsmanship. That's pretty cool. Yeah. And well, and that's always been a big thing. I mean, actually, the same is true. Even if the same is true of karate. The point where karate when karate got popular most in the 50s in the US is why the Fonz and Happy Days learned from Mr.
that's
Miyagi.
right.
That was also American servicemen who were stationed in Japan and looking for a new hobby. Um, okay, so we've been going on close to 2 hours now, which is usually when we end it. But I just sort of do a final call out for questions if there's anything anyone wants to ask um, before we finish up. So keep an eye on the chat.
Sorry if I missed the chat before. I was too
That's
focused on reading. Or talking, sorry.
that's okay. It's usually it should be my job to put up questions. To put up questions as they pop up, so you know to answer them.
It's
Um,
interesting. I've never done this before, so it's a learning experience.
oh yeah, it's good. It's well, I guess one of the weird experiences that you have with COVID is learning to live stream and learning to live stream what you teach. Yeah. So I've got a question from Nick. Do you guts go straight to target, to you know what I mean, or are they arced into target? So
both in a way. So if you're doing a draw cut, so the target, the quickest way, even though Japanese swords are curved, they only have a slight curve. So the quickest way to get to a target is a straight line. So you tend to draw straight in and then rotate with your hand and your elbow to cut. But if you're doing Kenjutsu, the difference between Yai and Kenjutsu basically means Yai is straight from the draw single-handed, and then as soon as you put your second hand on, it's a Kenjutsu technique. So Kenjutsu generally is arced into the target in my style. Some styles, do straight. Onaha Itoryu is very famous for its Kuroyama straight down cut. That's pretty much all they do. We tend to do, it's a very esoteric system. Like we cut the most powerful and we always win because that's the cut we use, which is cool. That's their methodology.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So sort of, so it was a big thing for me with particularly with Saber, was understanding that you don't want your hand to mimic the cut. This is which is what Mech's referencing is getting from the camera. When I say the way I teach cut is your hand punches, like your hand goes directly forward and back, and that and the tip arcs, but you don't want to arc your hand, or you don't want to bring your arm in an arc because then you're going to get countercut.
That's why you can tell someone who's good if you're watching videos. If they're doing this, it's bad. If the blade should be already there, like you rotate very quickly. So the motion, the easiest way to explain, this is how I explain to beginners, is this is how your hand should be, like holding the blade as you move, and then you twist. So basically, that's the motion, and the blade will move on it. It's body mechanics. It's hard to do unless you actually do it yourself. But from the side, the same thing. See, your hands are here, and see how just by rotating your wrists, it'll actually move the blade up. So if you do that in an arc, it travels very quickly.
Yeah, like that. Then that sort of small movement. It's like in or sort of my cue with Saber is a cut starts at the little finger. So the first thing you do is you squeeze your little finger, and that starts
exactly the same.
Bang, all the muscles go.
So Japanese sword, you only hold it properly with the two lower fingers, and that's your strength. I was actually picked by I injured my this finger rock climbing and pulled the tendon. And when I was in Japan, my instructor said, "Oh, do you have a problem with your finger?" He'd tell immediately by the way I was cutting.
Yeah. Okay. You just because it has an effect. Yeah. See, with this. For stability, the top two fingers and the thumb basically hold and give the angle and stability, but then the bottom two fingers are what there for giving impetus to the cut.
Yes.
Which is like biomechanically what these fingers are apparently for. Like, there's a reason why you have more dexterity in your top two fingers than your bottom two fingers.
So in Japanese sword, left hand is the power hand. It always stays on the center line. When you say center line, people, but it's slightly off. Effectively, it stays on the central axis of your torso. It can be like right hand is the control hand. So left is power, right is control.
Yeah.
So as you cut, see so this is a straight cut. See, this is what I mean by being on the center line. If I turn, it's still on my center line, and then if I turn together, the arc is my left hand is still on my center line.
Okay. Yeah.
And the same upwards, it ends up in the same position. So here or here.
Okay, cool. Sort of, and like, but that's also sort of keeping a very, very tight kind of angle.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
using the rotation of your body. Okay, cool. Let's get another question. So, great talk, guys. Timeouts for cutting. Any other reasons they're used?
There's lots of stories about why they're used. The most I can get is generally because they're free. That's why, you get the whole, it represents an arm. Yeah, probably. Depends on, so the tatami that we used to buy from Mugendachi are soft. So they're not used. So they're still, the reeds are still in their original form. used tatami is very tight. So probably two fresh tatami mats to a used tatami mat. So we usually cut doubles in competition, and as I found out recently, they have different weaves for different prefectures in Japan. So Aichi, which is where Nagoya is, they have much thicker weave. And I swear that I hadn't cut for about a year, and I hit this target, and I was like, I've just hit a piece of concrete. And my instructor's like, no, and he hit it, and he went, this one, we won't cut that one, because the amount of fiber that they use to weave the reeds together, it was just too much.
Wow, yeah.
But also as well, the tatami, so you can slice. So the individual reeds mean you get that feedback, and you can actually do a slicing motion. With bamboo, it's more of a chop. It's a different technique. That's where a lot of people make mistakes. That it's not through intent, but that's where you get a lot of people bend their blades cutting bamboo, because they use the same technique cutting bamboo as they do tatami, which is not good. On tatami, you need to hit and keep slicing. On bamboo, you need to percussively hit and then just follow through afterwards. So it's like almost like a two-phase cut, because of the wall of the bamboo. If you're cutting decent bamboo, which is about an inch and a half, 2 inches across, the walls are about half a centimeter across. So you need to have the impact to hit the wall and cut into it and then slice.
To sort of break, yeah. That's interesting. So the technique actually varies depending on what you're cutting.
Yeah. So sometimes don't think I've ever done it. You can roll tatami around bamboo, so that's quite challenging to cut. I've cut bamboo up to about 3 inches across. It's not recommended if you've never done it. Don't go start with small. I do a demo usually every year at a Japanese garden, and I still have to test myself because I don't cut it very often. I still got to have a go on a small piece to make sure I can do it, because it can shatter, it can, and it dries out. So they cut the bamboo for me in the morning, and it cuts really well. And then towards the afternoon, it looks really good in the demo because it explodes. But obviously that's quite dangerous because of the shards of it.
Yeah, you'd want to make sure the public's back for a safe distance.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is with cutting, as I say, the safest place is actually directly in front of the target. Generally, with all the stories over the years of blade failures and people being injured, the most dangerous place is 4 and 7 o'clock behind someone, because if the handle gives way, the blade will go backwards. That's generally the most unsafe place.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. I think it's like I've heard about that with a lot of test cutting. It's it's almost like being at a firing range where you're like, right, you need this amount of safe distance, and you don't want to stand, stand here and don't immediately rush in and investigate the cut afterwards when someone's.
But it's genuinely terrifying. As I said before, Japanese practitioners tend to get we're a bit stuffy and whatever, but there is nothing more terrifying than doing a live demo cutting in front of a crowd, because you're not worried about yourself stuffing up. You're worried about someone getting injured. And, as we mentioned before, 99.9% of the time, everything's going to be fine, but there's outside context issues. So it always scares me when I see some of the demos out there and people seem to be, swords flying willy-nilly. It's a very dangerous thing to do, and it's not, it's not to be taken lightly.
Oh yeah, no. And actually, I think the worst when you're doing public demonstrations is the public. The point where I used to do a lot of metal weapons reenactment combat, and which is situational awareness is really, really important. And the point where I started to feel confident that I had decent situational awareness, and that I wasn't just getting through from luck, was I was doing a demonstration at university. And we're doing it out of the way of some store, the OEX stalls and stuff. And I saw out of the corner of my eye, basically this woman just basically power walking through, and she had literally just barged through one of the. We actually had a spotter who had gone to basically said, "Hey, there's a demo there. Don't walk through it." And she'd power walked through him. And I saw out of the corner of my eye, called a stop to the bout, and then yelled at her for trying to walk through a sword belt. And there was this beautiful moment where she'd been stopped from walking, she was about to and you could tell she was about to arc up and yell at me for getting in her way until she realized that she'd actually done something very, very stupid.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think with any kind of demo, like the work, it's one thing to sort of be around other practitioners, and it's one thing to look at yourself. It's another thing when you've got members of the public about.
Yeah.
Cool. So I don't think there's any more questions, so we might sort of move to finish up. So usually after the live stream, we jump on Zoom and have a bit of a chat just so that we can actually, kind of talk to each other in quarantine. So the full address for that is in the Facebook event. It should show up in the chat comments for both YouTube and Facebook now. So yeah, I'm going to be on. I'm going to be on tonight. I'm going to set that up in just a sec. Matt, I don't know if you're going to be on or not, or if you need to.
Yeah, I might come on for a bit. I'm going to get a beer first, though. But
fair enough. I got my stash. The other thing, just the subject of COVID. So, for a while I was sort of making preparation to start back up. And then we had the Delta variant outbreak. But we do have a few small overheads for running these live streams. So if you can make a donation, it'd be greatly appreciated. Obviously, we're going to try and keep them free, and certainly for the duration of COVID. But yeah, if you wanted to say thank you and help out, that'd be good as well. But yeah, I think the main thing is thank you, Matt, for coming on and just sharing your knowledge. Yeah, like that was, it was a really good talk. Like I got a lot out of it, and I think it's also really just nice to, compare traditions and, think about how different people do things. So, yeah, thank you.
No problem. Thanks everyone for your questions. It made me think. It's good to keep me on my toes. It's just like training. You got to outside context is always good.
Yeah, no, we got to get some in. We got to get some in right now when we can't leave the house. So. Cool. All right, cool. I'm going to go jump on the Zoom, and I'll hopefully see everyone.
See you later on. See ya.